January 26, 1939. After almost 3 years of bloody war, Barcelona falls into the hands of the fascist army led by General Francisco Franco. This date will mark the beginning of the massive exodus of Spanish Republicans to their neighboring country, France. On July 18, 1936, following the trend of the fascisms that were emerging in Europe, a group of military dissatisfied with the progressive government democratically elected in Spain carried out a coup d'état. This will be supported above all by the church and the upper classes, who did not like the reformist character of the republic either. But thanks to the popular classes and the lower bourgeoisie, armed by the Republican government, this coup will be confronted, which will fail and provoke the beginning of the Spanish Civil War. After the policy of international non-intervention in Spain, proclaimed by Chamberlain, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, the Republican forces will be strongly disadvantaged, since Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy gave great help to the coup side, while the Republican side only received some help from the Soviet Union. Little by little, the different Republican territories fell to the fascists, producing different exoduses to France, especially to return to Republican Spain, until Barcelona fell, and with it the entire area of Catalonia, so the only thing left for the Republican forces to do was to escape through the Pyrenees. On their way to France, the trip will be hard. During the months of January and February, the mountains are snowed. Not only soldiers and militiamen are fleeing, but also men, women, children, the elderly, and entire families who have to leave their homeland behind to avoid being imprisoned or shot. Many of them are in terrible conditions due to hunger, war, and bombing. Sick, wounded, and mutilated, they manage to escape from Spain. Before arriving in France, they break their rifles, explode their grenades, and leave thousands of belongings that they will not be able to cross the border and will not leave in the hands of the enemy. The border will be closed, and only those with passports, children, the elderly, pregnant women, the sick, and the wounded will be able to cross. The number of exiles amounts to 500,000 people. At the end of 1938 in France, a decree was published in which the beach of Argelès was chosen to open a concentration camp for the internment of undesirable foreigners. The town of Argelès was an agricultural town with only about 3,000 inhabitants, so it was not prepared for the 100,000 refugees who arrived at the camp from February to June 1939. From July to September, the camp was closed, but with the beginning of World War II, the camp was reconverted into a reception camp for the so-called undesirables: Jews, Gypsies, Spaniards, Poles. From July 1940 to September 1941, the camp was managed by the Vichy regime, and there were devastating floods for the inmates and the camp facilities. At the end of 1941, the camp was finally closed. An estimated 220,000 were interned in this camp. Arriving at the camp in February 1939, the Spanish refugees found only the sea and sand to shelter them. The camp was nothing more than a barbed wire enclosure on the beach of Argelès, guarded by horsemen of the French colonial troops. These troops were very inhospitable to the inmates. They insulted them and sometimes beat them. There was no toilet, so the exiles relieved themselves there on the sand, in full view of everyone. The soldiers laughed. Worse was for the women. Some soldiers masturbated at the sight of them and even raped some of them. No one was surprised if a mulatto or even black child was born after a few months in the camp, since most of the colonial troops stationed in Algiers were Senegalese. The authorities handed out whistles so that if any of the soldiers tried to rape any of the inmates, the authorities could prevent it. The first months were hard in these conditions. There are only 48 documented deaths at this stage, but it is estimated that there were many more. According to the testimony of an exile, every day nurses came in and took away 7 stretchers with dead bodies. In addition, there was a lot of infant mortality because there was nothing to take care of the little ones. The inmates took shelter with blankets and even under cars in the automobile cemetery a few meters away and built precarious huts with these same fabrics and reeds to protect themselves from the cold. They also lit bonfires with whatever they could. The wind and rain also posed a new danger. Many were affected by illnesses, especially lung disease. Pneumonia, dysentery, tuberculosis, conjunctivitis, and scurvy were common. Drinking water was scarcely available, and people often had to queue for hours to get some. Unpotable water from pumps was used and caused an epidemic of dysentery. After about 5 days without food and drink, trucks arrived with provisions for the refugees. Bread was thrown from the truck and people struggled to get their ration. The inmates gave the slogan, not to go for the bread, they refused to be fed like animals. So after a few days, the same truck showed up with the sliced bread, giving a piece to each person. The budget for these provisions will soar to millions of francs, although the Republican government also paid the French. To care for the sick, tents were set up to be used as infirmaries and a hospital. Doctors and nurses were to be recruited from the camp inmates themselves. The French government sent airplanes to document the camp, and it was no coincidence that they filmed just after the bread was delivered. So the refugees agreed that when they heard the planes, they would put down their bread and raise their fists. It must be taken into account that most of the exiles were anarchists, socialists, or communists, and that the slogan of the Republican government at that time was to resist until a war broke out in Europe that would force the European democracies to liberate Spain from Franco's fascism. After Franco's victory on April 1, 1939, they began to mobilize those who wanted to return to Spain, always with the cries of betrayal from the rest of the inmates. Morale fell, and suicides of those who could not stand the situation were not uncommon. Other inmates also left the camp to regroup with relatives living in France. During the month of March, the inmates themselves built very simple barracks of wood, cane, and sheet metal, provided by the French government, although they were not enough. The camp was divided by the river between civilians and Republican soldiers who kept the military structure. The civilians had to form companies. Their chiefs would be the ones to address the military. The inmates helped each other to endure these conditions. A market began to emerge within the camp where clothing and food could be purchased. The currency used was French, no longer the currency of the Republic, and relatives tried to send money to the inmates. In July, the camp was closed, and the inmates redistributed to other camps. Meanwhile, a group of Republicans was recruited to repair and build barracks in Algiers. In September, the Second World War began, and the camp was reopened for stateless persons, foreigners, or Republicans, among them 14,000 men, 2,500 women, and 2,500 children. This time, the camp is in better condition, with straw mattresses and blankets, although there is still a shortage of water. Women and children were separated from the men. As Senegalese soldiers entered the barracks at night to rape the women, they armed themselves with sticks and one day killed 3 or 4 of them. So the French authorities replaced the Senegalese with French soldiers. But they continued to be harassed. In the maternity hospital in Elna, set up by Swiss Red Cross workers, pregnant women from the camp were helped. There, 300 children were born until the Argelès camp was dismantled. The new internees, some of them in their second time in the camp, started cultural and intellectual activities. A school was created in the women's camp with the help of the internee teachers. There was also still a lot of political action within the camp. France created work companies, and if you were not enlisted in them, your conditions were worse, with less food. Many of the internees ended up enlisted to fight against the Nazis on behalf of France or working on the construction of the trans-Saharan railroads. The women sewed for more bread rations. In the summer of 1940, after the surrender of France, France starved, and in Argelès, even more so. The camp is controlled by the SS and the Gestapo. The influx of refugees increases. There are Spaniards who have already passed through 4 camps, but there are also undesirables for the Reich, such as Poles, Ukrainians, Gypsies, and Jews. Many ended up in German concentration camps. One example is Mauthausen, which was populated with many Spaniards. The number of dead in the camp at this time increased substantially. The maternity hospital in Elna received skeletal children who had been born in the same maternity hospital. They helped as best they could, bringing them glasses of milk. In March 1941, the women entered the men's camp in protest, starting a serious confrontation because of the destination of brigaders to Africa for forced labor. The brigadistas were foreigners who saw in Spain the opportunity to fight against European fascism and came to fight on the side of the Republic. Finally, the camp was closed in September 1941. The fate of the Spaniards that made it through the camp of Argelès was different for each. Some went back to Spain, others stayed in France or went to America. Others helped liberate France from the Nazi occupation, and others were sent to Nazi camps or to French colonies.
Gallo negro, gallo negro.
The camp of Argelès was a nightmare for most of the inmates, but we have to keep in mind that it was a difficult situation that the French government had to face when 500,000 refugees crossed the Pyrenees. The conditions could have been better, and surely the French took advantage of the situation by using the inmates to work for them. Lots of French disliked them for being revolutionary. The goal of this video is just to make this story known, as it was forgotten for a long time. After Franco's victory, the Spanish Republicans were forgotten. They had no homeland. They had lost the war, and their fate was to suffer the consequences. They now had to look back at Spain and see how it was becoming a fascist dictatorship that would last almost 40 years until in 1975, the dictator died. They had no help during the Civil War. They had no help during the Second World War. And they had no help afterwards when Occidental powers took advantage of Franco's anti-communist policies to fight the Cold War, as they were afraid that a socialist government could replace the dictatorship. And all those crimes committed by the Franquist government have never been punished. After the dictator's death, a general amnesty was applied, and those who tortured, killed, pillaged, and incarcerated in concentration camps were never to pay for their crimes.
Cómo se mata en la guerra. Ay, que yo no tiro, que no. Ay, que yo no tiro, que no. Ay, que yo no tiro contra mis hermanos. Ay, que yo tiraba que sí. Ay, que yo tiraba que sí. Contra los que ahogan.